This is a slideshow about the history of Hendersons in the Shetland Islands. This slide shows you the location of the Shetland Islands. The picture on the left shows you traditional locations of Hendersons across Scotland. The picture on the right shows you that the Shetlands are located north of mainland and in between Iceland and Norway on the right. This is a nice poem written by George Stewart in 1892, where the merry dancers bright flit along the northern sky, basking in their fairy light. Tools, bays, and islands lie, boldly tower her crags on high, and the sounding ocean waves, mingling with the seabird's cry, echo through her lonely caves. The general characteristics of the Shetlands include a rugged and precipitous coastline. No point in the Shetlands is any more than 3 miles away from the sea. So the early settlers made their homes along these coastlines because that's where the soil was richest and had close contact with the sea where they were fishermen. The principal fuel of the Shetlands is peat, which is basically their topsoil. In terms of agriculture, it's not all that arable, not all that great for farming, and so people made their living from fishing and crofting. In terms of animals, it's mostly sheep, ponies, and cattle, and recently we've added fish farming. So this is a picture of a croft house. Crofting is farming of small plots of land on a restricted tenancy basis. It's still practiced there because it fits well with their standard of farming. They raise primarily oats and barley, but other crops are not suitable because it's so cold and windswept. So the primary areas for farming and crofting is along the coastline with pastures inside. So these pictures illustrate some crofters. They were farmers and fishermen, as shown in the top left. On the top right, we see their croft houses located along the shoreline. And on the bottom, we see the crofters digging up peat for their fuel. They're still well known for knitwear, fiddling, and ponies. The knitwear is helped along because of their sheep that have very fine wool. You see the pictures of lace and Shetland sweaters. You've probably heard of Fair Isle knitting. The fiddling style is upbeat and easygoing, and the ponies have been there 4,000 years. They're small and rugged animals. If you want to listen to some of their tunes, you can follow that link. In terms of towns, there's 2 main towns, Lerwick and Scalloway. Lerwick is the capital. It has about 7,000 population. And it has some of the more substantial buildings on the island. Scalloway is smaller. They're both shown here on the map to the right, kind of in the south-central area. Pictures, we have Lerwick on the left and Scalloway on the right. The historical populations of the island begin with the Picts, who came over from mainland Scotland. We know they were there because we can still see some of their buildings with the roundhouses and brooks. They're thought to have extensively tattooed bodies, and that's why you see the pictures there on the left. Following the Picts came the Norse. We're not sure if the Picts just disappeared or if they were exterminated or what, but they were no longer there. About in the 8th and 9th centuries come the Viking longships. The longships enabled them to travel further distances that allowed them to move from Norway over into Orkney and Shetland and then Caithness and Sutherland. At first, it's thought that the islands were a staging area that allowed them to have a break in between Norway getting over to the mainland. But then as time went along, then permanent settlements developed in the Shetland and Orkney Islands. In 875, Orkney and Shetland were part of the Norwegian state and remained strongly Scandinavian. By the mid-1100s, there's a growing lowland Scottish influence in the islands. Even yet today, we can still see the Norse presence in the Shetlands, most notable of which is the Uphelja festival in midwinter. In 1469, Christian, King of Norway and Denmark, gave the Shetlands to Scotland as part of a dowry for his daughter Margaret to marry the Scottish King James III. Upon this exchange, most of the Norwegians returned to their homelands, but some did remain in Shetland, including the progenitor of our Hendersons. Count Hemmison, also known as Hendrik Hendrickson, or Count Hemmison, the Great Food. He was the governor or chief justice or chancellor. He was given that position by King Christian I of Denmark. A little bit about the government of Denmark in the Shetlands. The highest office was the Food or President, followed by Parliament that met in Tingwall, where you see the red star on the map, close to Lerwick. Under him were the underfoods in each district. Under that were the councillors or lawmen that regulated weights and measures. And then on the local basis were the Renselmen parish constables. So in 1450, Count Hemmison arrived in the Shetlands, and as we saw in 1468, the Shetlands were given to Scotland. At that point, they believe Hemmison returned to Denmark, but his sons remained in the Shetlands. So following down by the mid-1500s, we arrive at Magnus Niniansen, and then following down a little later in the early 1600s, we have Ninian Magnusson, who changed his name to Ninian Henderson Bunus in the early 1600s. He is the first to assume the Henderson surname. So following the descendancy, we have Count Hemmison, Magnus Niniansen, Ninian Magnusson, who became Ninian Henderson of Bunus, and then Magnus Henderson of Bunus and Gardy, and then Magnus's 5 sons, Ninian, James, Gilbert, John, and David. Their descendants then took root in the Shetlands to spread the Henderson name. Their estates stretched across the Shetlands. So moving from the north down, Bunus, Unst, Gluss, Bressie, and Midgarth were the main areas where we begin the Henderson lines across the Shetland. These are some snapshots taken across those 5 regions. You can see the rugged coastline in Gluss and Bressie. See the settlements. We're all on the coastline everywhere, but we see it here in these pictures of Unst and Yell. And you see the pasture line in the background there on Midgarth. So now we refocus our thoughts about the genetics in the Shetlands. Recent studies about Norwegian inheritance in the Shetlands shows that Shetlands are very strongly Norwegian even yet today. 29.2% of the descendants in the Shetlands have Norwegian DNA. We compare that to Orkney, where it's a little bit less, 25.2%, and then Caithness, which is a little bit less yet, 17.5%, and all much greater than in England, where it's 5.6%. These types of genetics patterns persist because people tend to stay within a certain region and intermarry within that region, thus preserving the DNA inheritance patterns. If you look at the maps on the left, you see the various colored regions, and you can see that the genetics are well maintained within these regions. The little bottom square has a little purple Shetlands up to the north. So you can see within that region, it's a pretty tight-knit group. Kind of correlated with this are the language patterns. The map on the right shows you that there are these dialects within the Shetland Islands. So even within that small area, people must stay close-knit so that they can develop their own language patterns. You can click on that link and actually listen to some of the dialects. So now if we focus on the genetics within the islands, we see these patterns emerge. If you follow the green arrows, you will see that Fair Isle, Dunrossness, and South Shetland have similar genetic patterns. So looking down to the south, you see Dunrossness and Fair Isle, and if you move over to the right on that picture, that yellow area on the bottom has a genetic pattern that's different than the rest. Following the purple arrows, we see that the west and north areas are similar. So west around North Amveen and Delting, north around Unst and Yell. Following over to the purple areas on the map on the right, those are similar genetically. And then particularly close amongst those are Yell and Unst. Follow the red arrows up to the very far north and across to the very furthest part on the map on the right. So those are the genetic patterns. Now if we remember what we talked about where the Henderson estates were, I've marked those with the green arrows across the map, and you see that those pretty well correlate with the patterns of genetics. So Unst and Yell up there on the north, we said that they're very similar. That's where some of the sons had their estates of the first Hendersons. If we just look for Norse blood within the Shetlands, we find that it's high in the north and the west, low in the south, and actually pretty non-existent in the far south. So the red arrows up in Unst and Yell and the west are all very highly Norse. Yell and Unst are very closely related to each other. Fair Isle in the south and Walsey on the central east are low in Norse. And then in the south, very little Norse at all, with a sharp break there at that red dotted line. So what can we conclude from all this? Well, it seems that the recent DNA evidence correlates pretty well with a description of Henderson descendancy in William Henderson's ledger. So the early Hendersons of Viking descent, according to William Henderson, lived in the far north, west, and central Shetland. DNA evidence confirms that there's high levels of DNA in the north and west, with less in the east and south. So, if your ancestors trace to those regions in the Shetlands, you probably descended from Count Hemus in the 15th century Denmark. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to contact me. This is my email address, and I'm part of Clan Henderson Society.